Barron Trump had always admired his godfather, Clint Eastwood. The legendary actor and director was more than just a Hollywood icon. He was a symbol of resilience, integrity, and old-school toughness. Barron had spent years learning from Eastwood, absorbing his wisdom about life, success, and handling adversity. So when a group of liberal reporters attempted to humiliate the legendary filmmaker in a public setting, Barron knew he couldn't stay silent. It all started at an upscale charity gala in Los Angeles, an event meant to celebrate Eastwood's contributions to the film industry and his philanthropic efforts. The night was supposed to be a tribute, filled with admiration and appreciation. However, a few reporters in attendance had a different agenda. Known for their biased narratives and disdain for those with conservative leanings, they saw the event as an opportunity to corner the 94-year-old icon with loaded questions. As Clint Eastwood graciously made his way to the stage, a reporter from a well-known liberal network stood up, microphone in hand. "Mr. Eastwood," she began with a smirk, "given your history of controversial statements and support for certain political figures, do you think your legacy will be tainted?" The room fell silent. Eastwood, ever the composed man, simply raised an eyebrow. But before he could answer, another journalist jumped in. "A lot of younger audiences today see you as outdated, even problematic. How do you respond to people who think your brand of masculinity is toxic?" There were murmurs in the crowd. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, while others, who had come to honor Eastwood, looked visibly irritated. It was clear these so-called journalists weren't here for a meaningful discussion. They were here to make a statement, to tear down a man who had spent his entire life building a legacy of excellence. Before Eastwood could speak, a strong and steady voice rang out. "That's enough." Barron Trump, towering at 6'7", stepped forward. At only 18, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that immediately commanded attention. The reporters turned their cameras toward him, sensing a moment that could generate headlines. But Barron wasn't there to be their soundbite. "It's interesting," Barron said, his voice calm but firm, "how people who claim to fight for free speech and inclusivity are the first to try and silence someone whose views they don't agree with." The reporters blinked, caught off guard. "My godfather is one of the greatest storytellers of all time. His films have defined generations, and he has done more for this industry than any of you combined," Barron continued. "You don't have to agree with everything he believes, but to stand here, in an event meant to honor him and try to humiliate him with leading questions, that says more about your character than his." A few guests clapped. Barron wasn't done. "You talk about toxic masculinity," he said, glancing at the second reporter. "But Clint Eastwood represents strength, honor, and resilience. He didn't get here by whining or tearing others down. He worked hard, he took risks, and he earned his place. Maybe that's why his legacy will outlast all of your careers." By now, the audience was fully engaged. Some guests nodded in approval, while others openly cheered. Even Eastwood, known for his stoic demeanor, cracked a small smile. The first reporter, flustered, tried to regain control. "So you're saying people should never be questioned for their views?" she challenged. Barron shook his head. "No, I'm saying that if you're going to question someone, do it with respect. If you had asked him about his impact on cinema, his approach to filmmaking, or even his views in an open discussion, that would be one thing. But you didn't. You came here with the goal of shaming him. That's not journalism. That's an agenda." The room erupted into applause. The reporters, realizing they had lost control of the narrative, quickly sat down, avoiding further embarrassment. Barron turned to his godfather and gave him a respectful nod before stepping back. Clint Eastwood, ever the man of few words, finally spoke. "Well," he said, glancing at Barron with a hint of pride, "I think the kid summed it up pretty well." The gala continued as planned, with heartfelt speeches and tributes to Eastwood's incredible career. But the moment that would be remembered most wasn't scripted or rehearsed. It was the powerful defense of a young man standing up for his godfather against those who tried to bring him down. Barron Trump had spoken, and the world had listened. As the evening went on, the atmosphere in the room shifted. What had started as an attempt to ambush Clint Eastwood had turned into a defining moment, one that left even the most skeptical attendees reevaluating their perspectives. The media might have come looking for a spectacle, but what they got instead was a lesson in respect, honor, and loyalty. Barron remained composed, mingling with guests who approached him, many offering their admiration for how he handled the situation. "That was incredible," one Hollywood producer told him. "Most people would have just ignored them or laughed it off, but you stood your ground with intelligence and class." Clint Eastwood, never one for excessive praise, simply gave Barron a firm pat on the shoulder. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said with a smirk. "Keep that fire, kid. Just make sure you use it wisely." Meanwhile, the reporters who had tried to provoke a controversy found themselves on the receiving end of public criticism. Social media quickly picked up the story, with clips of Barron's response going viral within hours. Hashtags like #Barron stands tall, Eastwood legacy, and journalism or agenda trended as users debated the night's events. Even some mainstream commentators, who typically dismissed the Trump family, admitted that Barron had handled the moment with impressive poise. The fallout for the journalists was swift. Their network tried to spin the story, framing it as a heated discussion on Eastwood's legacy, but viewers weren't buying it. The overwhelming response was that they had been caught trying to manipulate a tribute event into a political spectacle, and they had failed spectacularly. Days later, Barron was approached for interviews by several major outlets. He declined most, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. However, in a rare statement to an independent media source, he simply said, "Respect isn't about agreeing on everything. It's about how you treat people, even when you don't see eye to eye." That single quote resonated across the internet, fueling even more discussions about the state of modern discourse. Some praised Barron for his wisdom beyond his years, while others speculated that he might one day follow in the footsteps of his father, perhaps not in politics, but as a leader in his own right. As for Clint Eastwood, the legendary filmmaker took the whole incident in stride. "I've dealt with critics my entire career," he told a close friend. "They come and go, but seeing that boy stand up like that, that's something special." And so, the night that was meant to be a simple tribute turned into an unforgettable moment, one where a young man proved that honor and loyalty still matter, and that sometimes the best way to silence the noise is simply to stand tall and speak the truth. In the days that followed, Barron Trump's bold defense of Clint Eastwood became the subject of countless discussions. Talk shows debated his composure, columnists wrote op-eds about his potential future, and social media continued to buzz with admiration for his ability to dismantle the reporters' attempts at humiliation. Even those who weren't typically fans of the Trump family had to admit, Barron had handled the situation with a level of maturity far beyond his years. Meanwhile, the journalists who had tried to ambush Eastwood found themselves in an unexpected predicament. Their attempt to craft a viral hit piece had backfired spectacularly. Instead of making headlines about Eastwood being problematic or outdated, they were now the ones facing scrutiny. Their credibility had taken a serious hit, and their network executives weren't pleased. Internal sources reported that the journalists involved had been strongly advised to be more careful in the future, as their actions had sparked backlash even among their own audience. As for Barron, he wasn't one to bask in the spotlight. While the world speculated about what his future might hold, whether he would enter politics, business, or perhaps even Hollywood like his godfather, he remained focused on his studies and personal ambitions. He had never sought fame or attention, but he had certainly gained something invaluable that night: respect. Clint Eastwood, ever the mentor, took Barron aside after the event for a quiet moment of reflection. "You handled yourself well back there," he said, his signature gravelly voice carrying weight. "But let me tell you something. This won't be the last time people try to twist the truth. The higher you rise, the more they'll come for you." Barron nodded. He understood that better than most. "But here's the trick," Eastwood continued. "You don't have to fight every battle. Some people aren't worth your energy. But when you do decide to take a stand, make sure it's for something that truly matters." Those words stuck with Barron. while the media frenzy around the gala eventually died down. The impact of that moment lingered. It had solidified his reputation as someone who wouldn't back down in the face of unfairness. It had also deepened his bond with Eastwood, a man who had spent decades facing criticism, yet never wavered from his principles. Months later, when Eastwood invited Barron to visit his ranch in Carmel, the two spent time riding horses, discussing films, and talking about life. At one point, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Eastwood turned to Barron and said, "You ever thought about telling your own story?" Barron raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Eastwood smirked. "You've got a voice, kid, and the world's already listening." It was a moment of foreshadowing, though neither of them fully realized it at the time. While Barron wasn't interested in chasing the limelight, he now understood the power of his voice, and that when used wisely, it could make a real difference. The sun dipped below the horizon. Barron looked out at the vast open land ahead of him, feeling a sense of clarity. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but one thing was certain. When the time came to speak again, he'd be ready. As Barron Trump sat on Clint Eastwood's ranch, the words of his godfather echoed in his mind. "You've got a voice, kid, and the world's already listening." He wasn't sure what to make of it yet, but he knew one thing. His life was changing. Whether he liked it or not, the world was beginning to see him not just as the youngest Trump, but as an individual with his own convictions, his own presence, and his own way of standing up for what he believed in. Over the next few months, Barron continued to focus on his education and personal growth, staying away from the media spotlight as much as possible, but that didn't stop the world from talking about him. Every public appearance he made was scrutinized, every comment he gave was analyzed. Some praised him for his composure, while others, especially in the media, continued to try and find ways to discredit him. Then came another moment that put him back in the headlines. At a university leadership forum, where Barron had been invited to listen to a discussion on free speech and media bias, he found himself once again at the center of controversy. A well-known liberal professor on the panel, clearly aware of Barron's presence in the audience, took a jab at Clint Eastwood without mentioning him by name. "We live in an era where outdated figures are still being glorified despite their regressive views," he said with a smug smile. "Perhaps it's time we stop romanticizing a certain type of so-called masculinity and start embracing a more progressive vision for the future." The audience stirred. Some students nodded in agreement while others remained silent, sensing the indirect attack. Barron, sitting a few rows from the front, clenched his jaw. He hadn't come here to make a scene, but he wasn't about to sit by while his godfather's legacy was diminished by someone with an obvious agenda. During the Q&A session, Barron calmly raised his hand. The moderator, likely aware of who he was, hesitated before nodding for him to speak. "With all due respect, Professor," Barron began, his voice steady, "you just dismissed decades of achievement with a single sentence. You talk about progress, but what's progressive about tearing down people who paved the way for others?" Clint Eastwood didn't just make movies. He told stories that challenged norms, that questioned authority, and that inspired generations. And he did it with honesty, not by pandering to what was popular at the time. The room fell silent. The professor blinked, caught off guard. "You say we should stop romanticizing masculinity," Barron continued, "but maybe the problem isn't masculinity itself. Maybe the problem is that we've lost sight of what real strength looks like. It's not about aggression or control. It's about discipline, honor, and standing by your principles even when the world turns against you." A few students began to clap, then more. Within seconds, the room erupted into applause. The professor, clearly rattled, tried to compose himself, but the moment had already slipped away. Once again, Barron had spoken his mind, and the world had listened. That clip quickly went viral, spreading across social media like wildfire. Supporters hailed him as a young leader in the making, while critics accused him of being a mouthpiece for his family's ideology. But the truth was simpler. Barron wasn't speaking for anyone but himself. When Clint Eastwood saw the clip, he simply chuckled. "Kid's got guts," he muttered to a friend. But behind the scenes, bigger things were happening. Influential figures began reaching out, curious about Barron's future. Would he go into politics, business, media? Offers came flooding in, speaking engagements, interviews, even book deals. But Barron wasn't interested in capitalizing on the moment. He had learned from his father's experiences, from his godfather's wisdom, and from his own instincts that patience was key. For now he would continue to observe, to learn, and to grow. But deep down he knew one thing: this was only the beginning. The world wasn't done watching him. And when the time was right, he would be ready to step forward once again, not as the son of a former president, not just as Clint Eastwood's godson, but as a man who had carved his own path. Because, as Clint had told him that night on the ranch, you don't have to fight every battle. But when you do, make sure it's for something that truly matters. As Barron Trump settled back into his routine, he couldn't ignore the shift that had taken place. He had always been a private person, content with observing the world rather than engaging in its battles. But now, whether he liked it or not, he was becoming a figure of influence. The invitations kept coming. Some political groups wanted him to speak at their events, hoping to mold him into the next big conservative voice. Media outlets, both friendly and hostile, clamored for interviews. Even Hollywood insiders reached out, intrigued by the way he had defended Eastwood. One producer even floated the idea of a documentary about his life, an idea Barron quickly dismissed. For now, he chose to remain in the background, focusing on his studies and personal interests. But one invitation caught his attention: an exclusive event in Washington, D.C., featuring a panel on the future of American leadership. The lineup included business moguls, former presidents, and cultural icons. And at the last minute, Barron received a personal request to attend. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't sure if he wanted to step into the political sphere, even indirectly. But after a long phone call with Clint Eastwood, he made his decision. "Go," Eastwood told him. "Not to make a statement, just to see who's really running the show." So he went. The event was held in a grand hall, packed with some of the most powerful people in the country. As Barron walked through the crowd, he noticed the whispers. Some people regarded him with curiosity, others with skepticism, but he remained unfazed. When the discussion began, it was filled with the usual political rhetoric, leaders talking about unity while quietly pushing their own agendas. But then, in an unexpected turn, one of the panelists, a well-known political commentator, decided to take a subtle jab. "We have to ask ourselves," the man said, smirking slightly, "if the future of leadership should belong to those who have earned their place, or to those who are simply born into privilege." The audience murmured. Everyone knew who the comment was aimed at. Barron leaned back in his seat, considering his options. He could ignore it. He could let it slide. But then he remembered Clint's words. "When you do decide to take a stand, make sure it's for something that truly matters." So he stood. Taking the microphone offered to him, Barron met the panelist's gaze. "That's an interesting question," he said calmly. "But let's be honest, most of the people in this room were born into privilege. The real question isn't about where someone comes from. It's about what they do with the opportunities they have." The room fell silent. Barron continued. "I've seen people who were handed everything and wasted it. I've also seen people who came from nothing and built something incredible. The difference isn't in their last name, it's in their character. Legacy isn't a free pass, it's a responsibility." A murmur of approval rippled through the audience. Even some of his critics seemed impressed by his measured response. The panelist, caught off guard, tried to recover. "So you're saying you deserve a platform?" Barron smirked slightly. "I'm saying nobody deserves anything. You earn it, just like Clint Eastwood earned his legacy, just like my father earned his place in history, and just like every person here has to prove themselves every day. The name might open a door, but it's what you do after that matters." Applause broke out, growing louder as more people joined in. The panelist, realizing he had been outmaneuvered, simply nodded and moved on. After the event, Several influential figures approached Barron, praising his composure and insight. Some encouraged him to consider public service. Others suggested he start writing, sharing his thoughts with the world. But as Barron stepped outside, taking in the cool Washington air, he wasn't thinking about politics or influence. He was thinking about something much simpler: his future. For the first time, he felt a sense of clarity. He didn't have to be what others expected. He didn't have to follow anyone's path but his own. And when the time was right, he knew he would step forward again. Not as a legacy, not as a name, but as a man ready to define his own story.